The massive orbital station of Nexus Prime buzzed with activity as beings from 100 different worlds conducted their daily business. Ships of every imaginable design docked and departed in a carefully choreographed dance that had continued for over 2 centuries. Among the gleaming corridors and pristine commercial districts, the wealthy elite of the galaxy mingled, traded, and politicked with the casual arrogance that came with unlimited resources. Princess Zaratiel of the Valerian Empire stood before the floor-to-ceiling viewport of her family's private suite, watching the endless stream of traffic below. Her crystalline blue skin caught the light from distant stars, creating patterns that shifted across her tall, elegant frame. Her arms moved in practiced gestures as she adjusted the flowing robes that marked her as nobility among her people. Her large, luminous eyes held an intelligence that had been carefully cultivated through the finest education money could buy. "The negotiations with the Terran delegation are proceeding well, Your Highness," announced Chancellor Vextar as he entered the chamber. The older Valorian's skin had taken on the golden hue that came with age and wisdom among their species. "Your father believes we can secure the mining rights to their outer colonies within the week." Zaratiel nodded absently, her attention still focused on the viewport. Somewhere down there, in a lower level she had never been permitted to visit, millions of beings lived and worked to keep this massive station functioning. She had read about them in her studies, but they might as well have been theoretical constructs for all the reality they held in her carefully sheltered existence. "Tell me, Chancellor," she said without turning around, "what do you know of the humans?" Vextar's 4 eyes blinked in sequence, a sign of surprise among their people. "The humans, Your Highness? They are adequate trading partners, technologically inferior to most spacefaring species, but they possess certain resources that make commerce with them profitable. Their emotional volatility makes them difficult to predict, but their labor is cheap and their colonies numerous." "That wasn't what I meant," Zaratiel replied, finally, turning to face her tutor. "I mean, what are they like? As people?" The Chancellor's confusion was evident in the way his secondary arms twitched. "I'm afraid I don't understand the question, Your Highness. They are humans. What more is there to know?" Zaratiel had grown up surrounded by beings who saw the galaxy in terms of profit margins, resource allocation, and political advantage. Every interaction was calculated, every kindness transactional. The very concept of genuine emotion or altruistic behavior was so foreign to her social circle that it might as well have been magic. Yet something in her father's dismissive comments about human sentimentality had sparked a curiosity she couldn't shake. "Prepare my personal transport," she commanded suddenly. "I wish to visit the commercial districts." "Your Highness, that's highly irregular," Vextar protested. "The lower levels are hardly suitable for someone of your station. The security risks alone—" "I am not asking for your approval, Chancellor," Zaratiel interrupted, her voice taking on the imperious tone that had been drilled into her since childhood. "I am informing you of my decision." 3 hours later, Zaratiel found herself in a part of Nexus Prime she had only seen in holographic briefings. The commercial districts were a maze of narrow corridors lined with shops, restaurants, and service establishments catering to the station's working population. The air carried a mixture of scents from a dozen worlds, and the constant hum of conversation in hundreds of languages created a symphony of controlled chaos. Her escort of 6 Valerian guards drew stares wherever they went. Their ceremonial armor and obvious military bearing marked them as clearly as a flashing beacon. Zaratiel quickly realized that her presence was causing exactly the kind of attention she had hoped to avoid. Everyone they encountered either bowed obsequiously or hurried away in fear. "Your Highness," Captain Moordeath spoke quietly into her ear, "we should return to the upper levels. This environment is unpredictable." Zaratiel watched a group of alien children scatter as her retinue approached their play area. Their parents quickly ushered them away, shooting nervous glances back at the heavily armed guards. Whatever she had hoped to learn about the common people of the galaxy, she wouldn't discover it while surrounded by the trappings of her rank. "Captain," she said, making a decision that would change everything, "I want you and your men to return to our quarters." "That's absolutely impossible, Your Highness. Your safety is my own responsibility," she finished firmly. "I am ordering you to return. That is final." The captain's distress was obvious, but he was bound by oath to obey direct commands from the royal family. After several minutes of heated but quiet argument, Zaratil found herself alone in the crowd for the first time in her life. The difference was immediately apparent. Without her obvious markers of wealth and status, she was just another tall, blue-skinned alien among thousands of others. People no longer avoided her path or stared in fear. She was invisible, unremarkable, free to observe without being observed in return. For the next several hours, she wandered the commercial districts with growing fascination. She watched families sharing meals in small restaurants, observed traders haggling over goods with passionate intensity, and saw children from a dozen different species playing together with a casual acceptance that adults seemed to have lost. There was a vibrancy here that was completely absent from her rarefied world above. As the station's artificial evening cycle began, Zaratil realized she had wandered farther than intended. The corridors here were narrower and less well-maintained. The shops were smaller and shabbier, and the foot traffic had thinned considerably. Warning signs in multiple languages advised that this area was restricted to authorized personnel only. She was about to turn back when she heard voices ahead. Staying in the shadows, she crept closer to investigate. Around the corner, three beings in the uniform of station security had cornered what appeared to be a small family of refugees. The parents were trying to shield their two children while speaking in rapid, pleading tones to the officers. "No unauthorized beings in this sector," one of the security officers was saying in heavily accented Galactic Standard. "You have no permits, no documentation. You come with us now." "Please," the father replied, his voice desperate. "We just need somewhere safe for the night. Our transport doesn't leave until tomorrow. We have nowhere else to go." Zaratil recognized the family as Calaxians, refugees from a system that had been devastated by corporate strip mining. She had read reports about their plight in her political briefings, but seeing them in person was entirely different. The children were thin and afraid, clinging to parents who were clearly at the end of their resources. "Not our problem," the second officer replied coldly. "Come quiet or we use force." Zaratil felt anger rising in her chest, an emotion she was unaccustomed to experiencing. Her upbringing had taught her that suffering was an inevitable consequence of poor planning and insufficient resources. Those who couldn't adapt deserved their fate. But watching these frightened children, she found those teachings ringing hollow. She was about to step forward and intervene when a new voice cut through the confrontation. "Hey there," called a human male as he approached from the opposite direction. He was unremarkable by human standards, medium height and build with brown hair and clothes that marked him as working class. What struck Zaratil immediately was the complete absence of fear in his voice, despite being outnumbered and facing armed security personnel. "This is official station business, human," the lead officer growled. "Move along." "Actually," the human replied with a casual smile, "I think there might be some confusion here." He reached into his jacket slowly, producing a data pad. "These folks are with me. I'm Tom Rodriguez, shift supervisor for Cargo Bay 7. These are my new contract workers." He handed the pad to the officer, who scanned it with obvious skepticism. Zaratil could see from her angle that whatever was displayed seemed to satisfy the man's examination. "This documentation wasn't filed properly," the officer complained, clearly disappointed at losing his prey. "Yeah, sorry about that," Tom replied, still maintaining his easy demeanor. "New system update. You know how it is with bureaucracy. Always something getting lost in the shuffle." The security team exchanged glances, clearly frustrated, but unable to find grounds to continue their harassment. After a few more minutes of posturing, they reluctantly moved on, muttering complaints about humans and their paperwork. Tom waited until they were completely out of sight before turning to the family. "You folks okay?" he asked in the same gentle tone Zaratiel might use when speaking to a nervous pet. The Calaxian father was staring at Tom with a mixture of confusion and desperate gratitude. "I don't understand," he said slowly. "Why did you help us? We have nothing to offer you in return." Tom shrugged, as if the question itself was strange. "Because you needed help. That's generally how it works, isn't it?" "But we are strangers to you," the mother protested. "Our species have never even had formal diplomatic relations." "So," Tom replied, crouching down to bring himself to eye level with the children. "You hungry little ones?" The children nodded eagerly, their earlier fear forgotten in the presence of this strange, kind human. Tom smiled and stood, addressing the parents again. "Look, I've got a small apartment not far from here. Nothing fancy, but there's a couch and some floor space. You can stay there tonight, and I'll help you get to the transport docks tomorrow. No strings attached." Zaratiel watched this exchange with growing amazement. In her world, every favor came with expectations. Every kindness had a price. The concept of helping strangers simply because they needed help was so foreign to her experience that she might have dismissed it as performance if she hadn't witnessed it firsthand. As Tom led the family away, Zaratiel followed at a distance. Her royal education had included training in surveillance techniques, and she was able to shadow them without being detected. Tom's apartment was indeed modest, located in a residential section that housed the station's human workforce. It was clean but small, clearly the home of someone who worked for a living rather than inherited wealth. She watched through a window as Tom prepared a simple meal for the family, sharing his own food without apparent concern for the cost. He spread blankets on the floor for the children and gave the parents his bed, choosing to sleep in a chair himself. There was no ceremony, no expectation of gratitude or future reward. He simply saw beings in need and acted to help them. For Princess Zaratiel of the Valerian Empire, this simple act of kindness was a revelation that shook the foundations of everything she had been taught about the nature of sentient beings. As she made her way back to the upper levels in the early hours of the artificial morning, her mind was racing with questions she had never thought to ask. What would it be like to live in a world where kindness was given freely, where help was offered without calculation or expectation of reward? What kind of society produced beings capable of such selfless behavior? And, most disturbing of all, what did it say about her own people that such behavior was not just rare among them, but actively discouraged as weakness? By the time she reached her quarters, Zaratiel had made a decision that would change not only her life, but potentially the fate of two civilizations. She was going to learn everything she could about humans and their strange capacity for kindness. And she was going to start by meeting Tom Rodriguez again, this time without the barriers of rank and wealth that separated her from the rest of the galaxy. The question was how to approach someone who had no reason to trust an alien aristocrat, especially one whose people viewed his species as little more than useful primitives. The answer came to her as she watched the sunrise through her viewport, and it was both simple and terrifying. She would have to become someone else entirely. The transformation required more planning than Zaratiel had initially realized. Simply changing her clothes wouldn't be enough to convince anyone that she was anything other than Valerian nobility. Her bearing, her speech patterns, even the way she walked had been shaped by a lifetime of privilege. She would need to become a completely different person. Over the following days, she threw herself into research with the same intensity she had once reserved for diplomatic studies. The station's vast database contained detailed information about every species that called Nexus Prime home, including the various refugee populations that had found themselves stranded between worlds. She studied their histories, their cultures, and, most importantly, their struggles. The Calaxians she had seen Tom help were far from unique. The galaxy was full of displaced peoples, victims of corporate expansion, planetary disasters, and political upheavals. Many ended up on stations like Nexus Prime, trapped between worlds with nowhere to go and no resources to get there. They survived on charity, odd jobs, and the kind of hope that only the desperate could maintain. Zaratil chose to become a Thyssarian refugee. The Thyssarians were a species that shared certain physical characteristics with Valorians, most notably the forearm configuration and similar height. However, their skin was typically a duller shade of blue-gray, and their facial features were more angular. More importantly, Thyssaria had been consumed by civil war for the past decade, creating a steady stream of refugees who rarely had any documentation or resources. Creating the physical transformation proved surprisingly straightforward. A combination of makeup, prosthetics, and carefully chosen clothing could alter her appearance enough to pass casual inspection. The real challenge lay in learning to think and act like someone who had lost everything. She practiced in the privacy of her quarters, learning to hunch her shoulders in defeat, to keep her eyes downcast, to move with the careful, hesitant steps of someone who had learned that drawing attention was dangerous. She studied recordings of actual refugees, noting how they spoke, how they carried themselves, how they interacted with the world around them. The hardest part was the psychological preparation. Zaratil had never experienced true need, never known what it meant to be hungry or afraid or dependent on the kindness of strangers. She tried to imagine what it would feel like to have nothing, to be completely at the mercy of an uncaring universe. But her imagination could only take her so far. After a week of preparation, she was as ready as she could make herself. Early one morning, while the station slept through its artificial night cycle, Princess Zaratil of the Valerian Empire ceased to exist. In her place stood Kiramel, a Thyssarian refugee whose homeworld had been destroyed in the war, leaving her with nothing but the clothes on her back and a desperate hope for asylum. The first test of her disguise came at the checkpoint leading to the commercial districts. The guard barely glanced at the forged identification she had created. His attention focused more on the holographic entertainment playing on his personal device. Her appearance was shabby enough to mark her as unimportant, someone whose presence required no special attention. Walking through the corridors she had explored as royalty was a completely different experience as a refugee. People who had seemed vibrant and energetic before now appeared hurried and stressed when viewed from the perspective of desperation. The abundance that surrounded her felt like mockery when she was pretending to have nothing. She found a spot in one of the smaller market squares and began her performance. With her few possessions spread on a worn blanket, she sat with the defeated posture she had practiced, occasionally looking up at passers-by with the hopeful expression she had seen on so many faces in her research. The first few hours were educational in ways she hadn't expected. Most people simply ignored her, their eyes sliding past her as if she were part of the station's infrastructure rather than a living being. Those who did acknowledge her presence were usually quick to hurry past, uncomfortable with the reminder of how precarious life could be for the galaxy's dispossessed. A few beings dropped small coins or food scraps, but their charity came with a distance that kept them separate from her suffering. They were buying absolution from guilt rather than offering genuine compassion. The transactions were quick, impersonal, and left Kira feeling more invisible than before. As the day wore on, she began to understand something that all her academic study hadn't prepared her for. Poverty wasn't just about lacking resources, it was about becoming invisible, about being transformed from a person into a problem to be ignored or solved from a safe distance. The wealthy beings who passed her saw a category rather than an individual, a representative of an unfortunate class rather than someone with hopes, fears, and dreams. The revelation was both humbling and infuriating. How many times had she herself looked past such suffering, dismissing it as an inevitable consequence of an imperfect universe? How many opportunities for genuine connection had she missed because she had been taught to see classes of people rather than individuals? By late afternoon, her respect for those who survived such circumstances had grown immeasurably. The constant vigilance required to stay safe The energy needed to maintain hope in the face of endless rejection, the skill needed to identify which strangers might offer help versus those who might pose a threat. It was exhausting work that required intelligence and strength she had never imagined. She was beginning to wonder if her plan would work at all when she spotted a familiar figure approaching from across the square. Tom Rodriguez was walking with the same unhurried confidence she remembered from their previous encounter, his human features standing out among the diverse crowd. He appeared to be heading toward one of the food vendors, probably taking a break from whatever shift he was working. Kira watched him carefully as he ordered something from a Viridian cook, noting how he interacted with the vendor. There was no condescension in his manner, no sense that he considered himself superior to the alien running the food cart. He joked easily with the cook, asked about the vendor's family, and paid without trying to negotiate the price down despite his obviously limited resources. When Tom turned to find a place to eat, his eyes swept across the square and landed on her. For a moment, Kira thought he might recognize her somehow, that her disguise had failed and she was about to be exposed. But his expression showed only the same gentle concern she had witnessed before. He approached slowly, careful not to startle her, and crouched down a few feet away. "Hey there," he said in the same soft tone he had used with the Calaxian children. "You doing okay?" Kira had practiced this moment in her quarters, but facing Tom's genuine concern made her prepared responses feel suddenly inadequate. The kindness in his brown eyes was so different from the calculating gazes she was used to that she found herself momentarily speechless. Yes, thank you," she managed, proud that her voice carried the right note of exhaustion and defeat. "Just trying to earn enough for food." Tom nodded, his expression thoughtful. "What's your name?" "Kiramel," she replied, using the identity she had crafted. "I'm Tisavian. My world." She let her voice trail off, as if the memory was too painful to complete. "I'm sorry," Tom said, and she could hear that he genuinely meant it. "The war." She nodded, not trusting her voice. The fiction she had created suddenly felt uncomfortably real as she sat there in her disguise, pretending to mourn a homeland she had never lost. "You have any place to stay tonight?" Tom asked. "I've been sleeping in the maintenance corridors," Kira admitted, which was actually true. She had discovered that several levels below the commercial districts, there were access tunnels that the truly desperate used for shelter. The experience of spending even one night in such conditions had given her a new appreciation for the luxury she took for granted. Tom was quiet for a moment, clearly thinking. When he spoke again, his words were careful, respectful. "I don't want to overstep, but I've got a small apartment not far from here. There's a couch you could use if you want. No strings attached, just a safe place to sleep." The offer was almost identical to what she had heard him give the Calaxian family, but experiencing it firsthand was entirely different. There was no sense of superiority in his manner, no implication that she should be grateful for his magnanimity. He was simply offering help to someone who needed it, as naturally as breathing. "Why would you help me?" she asked, genuinely curious to hear his answer. Tom smiled, the same easy expression she remembered from before. "Because you need help, and I'm in a position to offer it." Isn't that reason enough? For someone raised in a culture where every action had a calculated motive, his simple sincerity was almost incomprehensible. "But you don't know me. I could be dangerous." "Could be," Tom agreed cheerfully. "But you don't seem dangerous. You seem tired and hungry and alone. If I'm wrong, well, I guess I'll deal with that when it happens." His willingness to trust a complete stranger, to take risks for someone he had never met before, was so foreign to everything Kira had been taught about intelligent behavior that she almost laughed. In her world, such naivety would be seen as a dangerous weakness that others would ruthlessly exploit. Yet here was Tom, offering genuine kindness without apparent fear or calculation. Either humans were foolishly trusting to the point of evolutionary disadvantage, or they understood something about the nature of cooperation that more advanced species had forgotten. "Okay," she said quietly. "Thank you." Tom's apartment was exactly as she remembered it from her surveillance. Small, clean, and clearly the home of someone who worked with his hands for a living. But seeing it as a guest rather than a spy gave her a different perspective. The furniture might be secondhand and the decorations minimal, but there was a warmth here that was completely absent from her palatial quarters above. "You hungry?" Tom asked as soon as they arrived. "I was just about to make dinner." Kira nodded, realizing that she actually was hungry. Her nervous energy and the stress of maintaining her disguise had burned through the light breakfast she had eaten that morning. Tom moved around his small kitchen with practiced efficiency, preparing a simple but hearty meal from basic ingredients. He cooked enough for two without asking if she wanted to share, simply assuming that of course she would eat with him. "So," he said as they sat down at his small table, "what's your story? If you don't mind me asking." Kira had prepared a detailed backstory, complete with names, dates, and tragic events that would explain her current circumstances. But sitting across from Tom in his modest apartment, sharing a meal he had prepared for a stranger, the elaborate fiction felt unnecessary and somehow disrespectful. "My family was caught between the warring factions," she said, sticking to the broad outlines of truth without adding details that might invite too many questions. "I lost everything. Managed to get off-world, but I've been drifting ever since. No skills that translate to station work, no resources to get anywhere better." Tom listened without interruption, his expression sympathetic but not pitying. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment before responding. "That's rough," he said finally. "War's bad enough when you're fighting it, but it's hell on the people just trying to live their lives." His matter-of-fact acceptance of her story, combined with his obvious empathy for her supposed suffering, made Kira feel guilty about the deception. This man was offering her genuine compassion based on what he believed to be her circumstances, while she was lying to him for the sake of her own curiosity. "What about you?" she asked, partly to change the subject, and partly because she was genuinely curious about his background. "How did you end up here?" Tom shrugged, taking a bite of the simple stew he had prepared. "Not much a story, really. Grew up on a farming colony, but the corporate buyouts made it impossible for small farmers to compete. My family lost the land when I was 18. Figured I'd see what was out there in the bigger galaxy." He spoke of his own losses with the same matter-of-fact tone he had used when acknowledging hers, without self-pity or bitterness. "Found work on freight haulers, learn enough about cargo handling to get this job. It's not glamorous, but it pays the bills and I get to meet interesting people." "Like refugee aliens," Kira observed with a slight smile. "Especially refugee aliens," Tom agreed, grinning back. "You'd be amazed how many different perspectives there are out there once you start paying attention." As the evening progressed, they talked about everything and nothing. Tom asked questions about Thyssarian culture that Kira answered using information she had researched, while he shared stories about his experiences working with beings from across the galaxy. His curiosity about other species was genuine and without judgment, and his insights into the social dynamics of the station were surprisingly sophisticated for someone the Valerian Empire considered primitive. When it came time for sleep, Tom gave her the couch and took the floor himself, despite her protests. "You're the guest," he said simply, as if that settled the matter completely. Lying in the darkness of Tom's apartment, listening to his quiet breathing from across the room, Kira found herself confronting questions she had never expected to face. This human had opened his home to a stranger, shared his food, and offered protection without asking for anything in return. By the standards of galactic civilization, his behavior was irrational to the point of madness. Yet somehow, in the warm safety of his modest apartment, madness felt more sane than all the calculated wisdom she had been raised with. For the first time in her privileged life, Kira began to understand what it meant to receive kindness not as a transaction, but as a gift freely given. The realization would change everything that came after. The next morning brought new challenges that Kira hadn't anticipated. Tom woke early and prepared breakfast for both of them with the same casual generosity he had shown the night before. But as they ate, she could see him thinking, the gears turning behind his brown eyes. He said finally, spreading some kind of jam on a piece of synthetic bread. You seem pretty educated for someone who claims to have no marketable skills. Kira's fork paused halfway to her mouth. Had she made a mistake? Revealed too much of her true background? What do you mean? Your vocabulary, the way you structure your sentences, Tom explained, his tone conversational rather than suspicious. You speak Galactic Standard like someone who's had formal education. That's not something you usually see in refugees from the outer colonies. The observation was astute enough to make Kira nervous. She had practiced speaking like a refugee, but apparently not well enough to fool someone who actually paid attention to such details. My family was well off before the war, she said carefully. I had tutors. Tom nodded, accepting the explanation. That makes sense. Rich or poor, war doesn't discriminate when it comes to destroying lives. He paused, studying her face. But it also means you might have more options than you think. I don't understand. Education is valuable, Tom said, finishing his breakfast and standing to clear the table. Even if your specific knowledge doesn't translate directly, the fact that you can think, analyze, communicate, that's worth something. You just need to figure out how to market it. The irony of receiving career advice from someone her culture considered primitive wasn't lost on Kira. Here was a human with no formal education beyond basic colony schooling, offering insights into survival that none of her expensive tutors had ever provided. I wouldn't know where to start, she admitted, which was actually true. For all her royal education, she had never learned anything about finding work, supporting herself, or navigating the economy from the bottom up. Lucky for you, Tom said with a grin. I know people. One of the things you learn working for 8 is that every operation needs someone who can handle the paperwork, deal with different species, smooth over misunderstandings. You'd be surprised how much of interspecies commerce comes down to translation and cultural interpretation. He was already reaching for his personal communicator, scrolling through contacts. There's a woman named Elena Vasquez who runs a small trading company. She's been looking for someone who can help her expand into some of the newer refugee markets. Might be perfect for someone with your background. Kira watched him make the call with growing amazement. He was not only offering to help her find work, but actually using his own professional connections to do so. In her world, such assistance would come with clearly defined expectations of future reciprocity. People didn't risk their own reputations for strangers unless there was something significant to be gained. Elena, it's Tom Rodriguez, he said when the call connected. Yeah, I'm good. Listen, I've got someone here you might be interested in meeting. Thyssarian refugee, well-educated, speaks multiple languages. He continued describing Kira's fictional qualifications while she sat in stunned silence. By the time he finished the conversation, she had an interview scheduled for that afternoon. Tom had arranged for her to meet Elena at a small cafe in the commercial district, providing directions and even offering to loan her credits for appropriate clothes if needed. Why are you doing this? Kira asked when he ended the call. The question had been burning in her mind since the previous evening, and she couldn't contain it any longer. Tom looked at her with genuine confusion. Doing what? Helping me. You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. There's nothing I can give you in return. So why? The question seemed to puzzle him in a way that made Kira realize how fundamental their different worldviews really were. For Tom, helping someone in need wasn't an action that required justification. It was simply the natural response to encountering suffering. I guess, he said slowly, because that's what people do. When someone needs help and you can provide it, you help. It's not complicated. But what if I can't pay you back? What if I disappear and you never see me again? Tom shrugged. Then, I hope you find whatever you're looking for. The point isn't to get something back, Kira. The point is to make the galaxy a little less cruel for someone who's having a hard time. His answer was so simply stated, so fundamentally decent, that it made her chest tight with emotions she couldn't identify. In a universe where most beings saw kindness as weakness and compassion as inefficiency, Tom's basic humanity shone like a beacon. The interview with Elena Vasquez went better than Kira had expected. Elena was a middle-aged human woman with graying hair and sharp eyes that missed very little. Her trading company was small, but successful, specializing in goods that moved between human space and the various alien enclaves throughout the sector. "Tom tells me you've got language skills," Elena said without preamble as they sat in the busy cafe. "I need someone who can help me communicate with potential clients. Maybe do some cultural consultation. The profit margins in this business are thin enough without losing deals because of misunderstandings." Kira found herself drawing on her genuine diplomatic training as she answered Elena's questions. Her royal education had included extensive study of alien cultures, trade protocols, and negotiation strategies. For the first time since beginning her masquerade, she could be largely honest about her qualifications. "You know," Elena said after an hour of conversation, "you're overqualified for what I had in mind. Your knowledge of Valerian trade customs alone could save me a fortune in diplomatic fees." The comment made Kira nervous, but Elena seemed to interpret her discomfort as modesty rather than panic. "Don't worry," the older woman continued. "I'm not going to pry into your background. Half the people working out here are running from something. As long as you do the job and don't bring trouble to my door, I don't care if you used to be a queen or a criminal." By the end of the meeting, Kira had a job. It wasn't much, basic salary plus commission on any deal she helped close, but it was legitimate work that would allow her to maintain her cover while learning more about how humans approach business and relationships. Over the following weeks, she settled into a routine that was unlike anything she had ever experienced. Her days were spent in Elena's small office, helping to negotiate contracts, translate documents, and resolve the countless small conflicts that arose when different species tried to conduct business together. The work was challenging in ways her royal education hadn't prepared her for. Academic knowledge of alien cultures was very different from actually mediating disputes between a Cantorian freight captain and a Delvarian cargo owner who had fundamentally different concepts of punctuality. But she found the practical problem-solving engaging in a way that diplomatic theory had never been. More importantly, she was learning to see the galaxy from an entirely different perspective. Elena's clients were small traders, independent freight operators, and family businesses trying to carve out a living in the shadow of the great corporate empires. They operated on thin margins and personal relationships, where trust was the most valuable currency and reputation could make or break a company overnight. "The big corporations think they understand trade," Elena explained during one of their working lunches. "They've got algorithms and market analysis and predictive models that can tell them exactly what to sell where. But they miss the human element." She gestured toward a table where a Quailish merchant was sharing a meal with a human ship captain, their children playing together while the adults discuss cargo manifests. Business isn't just about moving goods from point A to point B. It's about relationships, understanding what people actually need versus what they think they want. The corporations can't replicate that because they don't see their clients as individuals. Kira thought about her family's own business empire, built on exactly the kind of algorithmic efficiency Elena was describing. The Valerian approach to commerce was to identify markets, calculate optimal profit margins, and execute transactions with maximum efficiency. The idea that personal relationships might be more valuable than mathematical precision was revolutionary. Her evenings were often spent with Tom, who had become something like a friend in the weeks since their first meeting. He would stop by Elena's office after his shift, and they would walk through the commercial districts together, talking about everything from galactic politics to the philosophical implications of faster-than-light travel. Tom's perspectives on these topics were unlike anything Kira had encountered in her formal education. He approached complex issues with a combination of practical wisdom and moral clarity that cut through the sophisticated justifications her tutors had always favored. When she asked him about the refugee crisis, for example, he didn't launch into discussions of resource allocation and political stability. Instead, he talked about families torn apart by forces beyond their control and the basic obligation that prosperous societies had to help those less fortunate. "The way I see it," he said one evening as they shared dinner at a small restaurant that served food from across human space. Civilization is supposed to be about making life better for everybody, not just the people who already have advantages. If your society is only working for the wealthy and powerful, then it's not really civilized, it's just organized exploitation. His casual dismissal of everything her culture considered the natural order of things was both fascinating and disturbing. But surely there have to be incentives for achievement, Kira argued, falling back on economic theories she had been taught since childhood. If everyone receives the same benefits regardless of their contribution, why would anyone strive to excel? Tom smiled, the patient expression he wore when they disagreed about fundamental principles. Who said anything about everyone receiving the same benefits? I'm just saying that basic dignity and survival shouldn't be luxury goods that only the wealthy can afford. He pointed to a family at another table, parents working together to help their young child eat while managing a squirming infant. Those people aren't asking for mansions and private shuttles. They want their kids to have enough food, access to education, medical care when they're sick. The idea that providing those basic necessities somehow destroys the incentive to achieve is just something rich people tell themselves to justify hoarding resources. The conversation continued late into the evening, touching on topics that revealed just how different human and Valerian philosophies really were. Where her people saw hierarchy and competition as natural law, humans seem to believe in cooperation and mutual aid as fundamental social values. Where Valorians viewed suffering as an inevitable consequence of inadequate resources or planning, humans saw it as a problem to be solved collectively. It wasn't that humans were naive about the realities of scarcity and competition. Tom's own background proved that humans understood loss, struggle, and the harsh necessities of survival. But somehow they had managed to maintain compassion and hope in the face of those realities, rather than using them as justification for abandoning social responsibility. The more time Kira spent among humans, the more she began to understand why other species found them unpredictable and difficult to categorize. They weren't the primitive, emotional creatures her people believed them to be. They were something far more dangerous to the established order. They were proof that intelligence and technological advancement didn't have to come at the cost of basic decency. As her masquerade continued, Kira found herself changing in ways she hadn't expected. The constant awareness of being dependent on others' kindness, even if that dependence was voluntary and temporary, had taught her things about vulnerability and trust that no amount of academic study could have provided. She began to notice details about the station's social dynamics that had been invisible from her privileged position above. She saw how the human workers formed informal networks of mutual support, sharing resources and opportunities without formal agreements or legal obligations. She watched them include aliens in these networks based on character and need rather than species or status. She observed their children playing together across species lines, learning cooperation and empathy as naturally as breathing. Most remarkably, she discovered that this wasn't unique to Tom or Elena or the specific human she had come to know. It seemed to be a fundamental characteristic of human social organization, as basic to their nature as the forearm configuration was to Valerian anatomy. The realization was both inspiring and terrifying. If humans could maintain such social cohesion and mutual care while also developing advanced technology and exploring the galaxy, what did that say about species like her own that had built their civilizations on hierarchy and exploitation? More personally, what did it say about her own future? Could someone raised in the Valerian system ever truly learn to think like a human? Could she return her old life, knowing what she now knew about alternatives? As the weeks turned into months, those questions became more urgent. Her family would eventually expect her to return, to resume her duties as a princess and heir to one of the galaxy's most powerful trading empires. But how could she go back to a world where kindness was weakness and compassion was inefficiency. The answer, when it came, would test everything she had learned about the differences between human and Valerian values. The crisis that would change everything began with a routine trade negotiation that went catastrophically wrong. Elena had been working for months to establish a relationship with a consortium of Valerian merchants who controlled shipping routes through several key systems. The potential contract was worth more than her company had made in the previous year, representing a chance to expand beyond the small-scale operations that had defined her business. Kira had been instrumental in the preliminary negotiations, using her genuine knowledge of Valerian customs to navigate the complex protocols required for such discussions. She had been careful to present her expertise as academic knowledge rather than lived experience, but her insights had proven invaluable in avoiding the cultural pitfalls that had doomed previous attempts at human Valorian commerce. The final meeting was scheduled to take place in one of the station's formal conference facilities, a neutral space designed to accommodate the needs of multiple species. Elena was nervous, but optimistic as she made final preparations for what could be the most important negotiation of her career. "I couldn't have gotten this far without your help," she told Kira as they reviewed their strategy one last time. "Valorians are notoriously difficult to work with, but you've managed to make them see us as legitimate business partners rather than primitive opportunists." The irony of the comment made Kira's stomach clench with guilt, but she pushed the feeling aside. She had become genuinely invested in Elena's success, not just as part of her disguise, but because she had come to respect the older woman's integrity and determination. When they arrived at the conference facility, Kira immediately recognized the lead Valerian negotiator. High Merchant Zeltar was one of her father's most trusted advisors, a being whose political acumen was matched only by his ruthless business practices. She had attended formal dinners with him, studied his negotiation strategies in her diplomatic classes, and learned to navigate his considerable ego during court functions. Seeing him across the conference table, resplendent in the flowing robes that marked his high status, was like being confronted with a physical representation of everything she had temporarily left behind. Worse, there was a moment when his four eyes seemed to focus on her with something like recognition before moving on to Elena. The negotiation began well enough. Elena presented her company's capabilities with confidence, demonstrating the efficiency and reliability that had built her reputation among smaller clients. The Valorians listened with the polite attention that passed for engagement among their people, asking detailed questions about shipping schedules, cargo capacity, and insurance arrangements. Kira found herself in the strange position of translating not just languages but entire ways of thinking. When the Valorians expressed concerns about cultural contamination of their goods during transport, she helped Elena understand that they were worried about human crew members potentially altering or sampling the cargo. When Elena talked about building long-term partnerships, Kira explained to the Valorians that humans viewed business relationships as ongoing social connections rather than discrete transactions. For most of the afternoon, it seemed like the negotiation would succeed. Both sides were finding common ground, and the financial terms were being worked out to everyone's satisfaction. Kira began to allow herself to hope that Elena would get the contract that could transform her business. Then, High Merchant Zeltar made a casual comment that destroyed everything. "Of course," he said in the tone of someone stating an obvious fact, "we would need to establish separate facilities for handling cargo contaminated by human contact. My people have certain standards regarding hygiene and purity that must be maintained." The conference room fell silent. Elena's face went through several expressions as she processed what she had just heard, finally settling on controlled anger. "I'm sorry," she said carefully, "but are you suggesting that human workers are somehow unclean?" Zeltar seemed surprised by her reaction. "It's simply a matter of biological compatibility," he explained with the patience one might show to a slow child. "Human physiology produces certain compounds that are considered undesirable by Valerian consumers. It's nothing personal, you understand. Simply a matter of market preferences." Kira watched Elena struggle to maintain her professional composure in the face of what was essentially a declaration that humans were inherently inferior. She wanted to intervene, to explain that Zeltar was expressing personal prejudices rather than established science. But doing so would require knowledge that Kiramel, the refugee, shouldn't possess. I see, Elena said finally. And what other market preferences should I be aware of? Zeltar seemed oblivious to the dangerous edge in her voice. Well, naturally, any human crew members would need to undergo regular medical screening to ensure they're not carrying diseases that might affect more developed immune systems. And there would need to be strict protocols about which areas of the cargo holds they're permitted to access. Developed immune systems, Elena repeated slowly. Yes, the Valerian immune system is considerably more sophisticated than those found in younger species, Zeltar continued, warming to his favorite topic. It's one of the advantages that comes with millions of years of evolution and selective breeding. Humans, being relatively new to space travel, simply haven't had time to develop the same level of biological refinement. Kira felt something inside her break as she listened to Zeltar casually espouse the racist ideology she had been raised on. For months, she had been living among humans, experiencing their kindness and generosity firsthand. She had seen their intelligence, their creativity, their fundamental decency. To hear them dismissed as primitive and contaminated was more than she could bear. "That's enough," she said, her voice cutting across the conference table with an authority that made everyone freeze. Elena turned to look at her in surprise. The Valorians focused their attention on her with sudden interest. In that moment, Kira realized that she had spoken in the formal register of High Valerian, using grammatical structures that were only taught to the nobility. High Merchant Zeltar's 4 eyes went wide with recognition. "Princess Zaratil," he said in shock. "What in the name of the eternal depths are you doing here?" The disguise that had protected her for months crumbled in an instant. Elena stared at her with a mixture of confusion and growing understanding, while the other Valorians in the room began to realize who they had been speaking in front of. "Your Highness," Zeltar continued, recovering from his shock with admirable speed, "I had no idea you were conducting an investigation into human business practices. Your insights into their primitive methods will be invaluable for future policy decisions." An investigation? Kira found herself standing, her carefully maintained posture of defeat replaced by the commanding presence she had been trained to project since childhood. "Is that what you think this is?" "Please, Your Highness," Zeltar said nervously, glancing at Elena and the other humans in the room. "Perhaps we should continue this discussion in private." "No," Kira said firmly. "I think it's time for some honesty." She turned to face Elena, whose expression had shifted from confusion to hurt understanding. "Elena, I owe you an explanation. My name isn't Kiramel. I'm Princess Zaratil of the Valerian Empire, and I've been lying to you since the day we met." The admission hung in the air like a physical weight. Elena's face went through several emotions before settling on a carefully controlled neutrality that was somehow worse than anger would have been. "I see," Elena said quietly. "And the reason for this masquerade?" Kira took a breath, knowing that her next words would determine not just her own future, but potentially the relationship between two civilizations. "Because I wanted to understand what humans were really like. I'd been raised to believe that your species was primitive, emotional, and fundamentally inferior to more advanced civilizations. I wanted to see if that was true." "And what did you discover, Your Highness?" Zeltar asked, his tone suggesting that he expected her to confirm everything he had just said about human inadequacy. Kira looked around the room, taking in the faces of beings from 2 very different cultures who were waiting to hear her judgment. The humans looked hurt and betrayed, while the Valorians expected vindication of their prejudices. "I discovered," she said slowly, "that everything I'd been taught about humans was not just wrong, but backwards." She gestured toward Elena. "This woman gave me a job when I was pretending to be a refugee with nothing to offer. She paid me fairly, treated me with respect, and never asked questions about my background that might have made me uncomfortable. She built her business on personal relationships and mutual trust rather than exploitation and fear. She turned to address Zeltar directly. Tom Rodriguez, a human cargo worker, risked his own safety to help a family of strangers. He gave up his own bed to provide shelter for beings he had never met before. He spent his personal time and resources helping me find work, expecting nothing in return except the satisfaction of helping someone in need. The Valorians exchanged glances that suggested they were hearing about aberrant behavior rather than admirable qualities. "Your Highness," Zeltar said carefully, "individual acts of sentiment don't change the fundamental realities of species hierarchy. Humans may be capable of occasional kindness, but they lack the intellectual sophistication and emotional control necessary for true civilization." "Emotional control?" Kira laughed, the sound sharp enough to make everyone in the room flinch. "You mean the ability to watch suffering without feeling compelled to act? The capacity to calculate profit margins while beings starve in the corridors below? The sophistication to justify cruelty with economic theories?" She walked around the table until she was standing directly in front of Zeltar. "I've spent months living among humans, and I've learned something that apparently none of our great educational institutions bothered to teach me. Intelligence without compassion isn't sophistication, it's sociopathy." The room erupted in voices as everyone tried to speak at once. The Valorians were expressing shock and outrage that a member of the royal family would dare to challenge fundamental assumptions about species superiority. Elena was trying to process the revelation that her trusted employee was actually one of the most powerful beings in the galaxy. "Enough!" Kira's voice cut through the chaos with imperial authority. The room fell silent again. "Elena," she said, turning to face the human woman who had unknowingly become her teacher, "I know I betrayed your trust, and I don't expect forgiveness. But I want you to know that working with you has been the most valuable education of my life. You taught me things about dignity, respect, and genuine leadership that no royal tutor ever could." Elena studied her for a long moment before responding. "Why tell us now? You could have maintained your disguise indefinitely." "Because," Kira said, glancing back at the Valorians, "I can't sit here and listen to people I care about being dismissed as primitive and inferior when I know the truth. Humans aren't less evolved than Valorians. They're more evolved. You've managed to combine advanced technology with basic decency, something my people clearly haven't achieved." High Merchant Zeltar's skin had taken on the purple hue that indicated extreme agitation among Valorians. "Your Highness, these statements border on treason. To suggest that humans are superior to Valorians is to deny millions of years of evidence and established scientific fact." "What scientific fact?" Kira challenged. "Show me the studies that prove Valorian superiority. Demonstrate the evidence that justifies treating other species as inherently inferior." "The evidence is self-apparent," Zeltar sputtered. "Our technology, our culture, our empire, built on the exploitation of others," Kira interrupted. "Our wealth comes from strip mining other species' worlds. Our technology advances through stealing the innovations of primitive cultures. Our empire exists because we're willing to use force against anyone who resists our economic domination." She turned back to Elena, who was watching this exchange with fascination despite her personal hurt. "Elena, I'm formally renouncing my position as a negotiator for the Valorian delegation. But I'd like to make a proposal in my personal capacity." Elena raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening. My family's shipping empire is one of the largest in the galaxy. We have contacts, resources, and infrastructure that could transform your business overnight. But we do things differently than what Zeltar was proposing. We create genuine partnerships based on mutual respect and fair compensation. We don't demand special protocols or segregated facilities or medical screening. We treat our business partners as equals." The room was dead silent as the implications of her offer sank in. Elena would be gaining access to resources beyond her wildest dreams, while the Valerian Empire would be entering into an unprecedented partnership with a human operation. What would you want in return? Elena asked suspiciously. The chance to learn, Kira replied honestly. I want to study how humans conduct business, how you build relationships, how you maintain trust and cooperation across species lines. I want to take those lessons back to my people and try to change how we approach interspecies relations. Your Highness, Zeltar said desperately. You cannot seriously be considering— I'm not just considering it, Kira interrupted. I'm doing it. Elena, do we have a deal? Elena looked at her for a long moment, clearly weighing the benefits against the risks of trusting someone who had already deceived her once. Finally, she extended her hand in the human gesture of agreement. We have a deal, she said, but I have conditions. Name them. First, no more lies. If we're going to work together, I need to know who I'm really dealing with. Second, your people treat my people as equals. No special protocols, no segregation, no assumption of superiority. Third, if you're serious about learning from us, then you need to start acting like one of us. That means taking the night shift, doing your share of the physical work, and earning respect through actions rather than birthright. Kira smiled, feeling lighter than she had in months. Agreed. As the formal negotiations resumed with radically different parameters, High Merchant Zeltar attempted one last intervention. Princess, when your father learns of these arrangements, the political consequences will be severe. You're risking not just your own position, but the stability of the entire empire. Good, Kira replied. Maybe it's time for some instability. Maybe it's time for my people to learn what humans discovered long ago, that a civilization's worth isn't measured by how much it can take from others, but by how much it's willing to give. 6 months later, the Valorian-Human Partnership had become the most successful joint venture in the sector. More importantly, it had sparked similar collaborations throughout human space as other species began to realize that humans offered something unique in galactic commerce, the possibility of genuine friendship rather than mere transaction. Princess Zaratil, now known to her human colleagues simply as Zara, split her time between Elena's expanding operations and her slowly healing relationship with her family. The Emperor had initially threatened to disown her for her disgraceful associations, but the massive profits generated by human partnerships had eventually overcome even Valerian prejudice. Tom Rodriguez, the cargo worker whose simple kindness had started it all, was promoted to Director of Interspecies Relations for the partnership. His natural ability to connect with beings from different backgrounds made him invaluable in negotiations that required trust rather than leverage. As Zara stood in the observation deck of the partnership's new headquarters, watching human and Valerian crews work side by side to load ships bound for every corner of the galaxy, she reflected on how much had changed since that night when she had first witnessed Tom's casual compassion. Elena joined her at the viewport, carrying 2 cups of coffee in the human tradition they had all adopted. Any regrets? She asked, offering one of the cups. Zara took the coffee and considered the question. She had given up a life of unimaginable luxury and privilege for the uncertain rewards of actual work and genuine relationships. She had risked everything on the belief that kindness was stronger than calculation, that cooperation was more valuable than domination. None, she said finally, watching a mixed crew of humans and Valorians share a joke as they secured cargo containers. I finally learned what it means to be truly civilized. In the distance, ships lifted off bound for destinations across the galaxy, carrying not just goods, but the revolutionary idea that different species could work together as equals. It was, Zara reflected, a much better legacy than another conquered world or exploited resource. And it had all started with one human's simple decision to help a stranger in need.